I'm talking today about what is ME/CFS, fibromyalgia, and post-infection syndromes in general. These are just a few of the labels, but actually it's a really wide umbrella of nervous system neuromuscular conditions that this information will be relevant for. I say that, but in the same breath I also say this is not intended to be medical advice. This is experiential advice. This is me pulling from my own story and from my own sort of human desire to look across probably hundreds of people's stories and find the patterns and commonalities. And I think this is information which is slowly getting out there now. But here it's presented obviously for free, and it's presented in a way which is casual and not behind a paywall. So the first slide is about the setup and the trigger, and it's obviously really complicated. It's such a complicated condition and conditions. So with conventional medicine and a conventional understanding is there is some trigger and then there is an onset of symptoms which you are told you cannot recover from and you have to manage. I obviously disagree with that. Obviously, the level of severity, and the actual symptoms, are individual, and it's different for everyone. In my time, I've heard stories of people going from massive kind of financial jobs, running marathons on the weekend, to a virus, and then within months they're in a wheelchair. And then you hear stories of people who have a much more sort of gradual onset and maintain a certain level of functionality for decades, but things are not fully right. It's such a vast spread of symptoms and possibilities and severity. But just so we're clear, we'll kind of go over the hallmarks of these conditions, which would be what is called PEM, which is post-exertional malaise. And it's a really terrible, terrible term because malaise sounds pretty mild. And, obviously malaise doesn't really describe what can happen. The simpler term is there is exposure, and that could be just, if you're at a mild level, going to work. At a more serious level, it would be any sort of muscle movement. And then there is a payback. And there is, we can call it a crash, but it doesn't necessarily always have to be a crash. But there is a symptom in response to that exposure or a shutdown at a kind of cellular mitochondrial level. And the symptom could be, anything within the realm of the word dysautonomia, which is to do with the autonomic nervous system. So the symptom will see a elevation of sort of dysregulation with the heart, with breathing, at a level that you can't sort of personally measure. Your immune system will have dysfunction. And the exposure it doesn't have to be muscle movement. It can be exposure to light and to vibration at a more serious level and to noise. We just have this seriously hyped up nervous system. And as I said, there's a shutdown, but there's also an increase in this dysregulation. And so often, down the line with this illness, the muscles are have gone into, I don't want to always call it paralysis because it can be a paralysis, but most of the time it's more of a just severe weakness, which you can hold yourself up for short periods of time. Obviously, this is at a really severe level, and it would just be aches and pains and like you climbed a mountain for someone with a milder illness, but your legs are still functional. But at the same time that's happening, there's just this increase in crazy dysregulation where you'll be in a crash, you'll be resting, but your breathing is getting quite laboured, your heart rate, and that's when something like POTS comes in, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And it's so interesting, witnessing it when you have names for it and an understanding that it's really just all about the autonomic nervous system. So that is PEM. And as you can see, the word malaise doesn't describe it accurately at all. And I'll talk a bit later about the mitochondria, which is, for people who don't know, that's like the sort of battery of the cell in a sense. And so we have these crashes, and as I said, they can vary so differently from people just being so worn down. And the interesting thing also, they will change in time for someone. So they're not even just like one person has a set of symptoms ongoing. How, these functional symptoms work is really fascinating. Often when you work on one symptom and the body, and you haven't resolved the sort of underlying limbic responses, a new symptom will pop up because it's trying, I really believe the body is trying to send you danger signals and try and protect you by activating these symptoms, which are so, devastating, but the body is working in what it believes is your own best interest. So when I started walking again, or trying to walk again, off from sort of bedbound wheelchair level, that's when the fibromyalgia started. So it was like, oh no, you don't. You're going to try and start walking. We're going to now give you lots of sort of pain and swelling, and all sorts of other stuff came. And it's because these symptoms are really dynamic and clever. So just from a personal experience, early on when I was pretty functional, would have been classed as mild, if I had big exertions of energy. For example, I was doing a horticulture project and I was out strimming a meadow in sort of hot summer climate, and I would come back in the evening and get what felt like the onset of flu, when your body goes very numb and you get a fever. And that would happen, and then it would resolve by the morning, and then I'd go out again and work physically, and I'd get it the same day. And it's very strange at first, but I wasn't physically having the muscle shut down. I had very mild symptoms for years, where I just had a temperature and nausea for a couple of hours every morning. So once again, these symptoms can just shift and change, and it's really interesting to have witnessed that over the last 10 years. As time moves on, you can experience a migraine after having a big sound exposure. You can have crazy hormone, kind of very physical, cycle-related hormone symptoms. You can have leg paralysis. I mean, the list really, if it's to do with the nerves, the muscles, anything of the autonomic nervous system, which is most of the organs and systems in the body, it can happen. It's functional, and it's to do with these syndromes. So to get back to this slide, sorry, that was a bit of a detour, but before we get ill is really important in examining as you're making your recovery, and don't get fixated on the trigger, which often can be a virus, a parasite. It could be a tick bite, it could be physical trauma, anything especially involving like neck, spine, mold, all that stuff. Like, yes, that will be part of the story, and that's a stress on your system, but there tends to be, with most people that I've come across, a story going back decades of chronic infections, this kind of stuff going on, building up. It's cumulative. And something that isn't on this slide, but I do think it's relevant. I mean, there's the little graphic of the physical trauma. It doesn't need to be big T trauma. And I would kind of add on to that graphic a foundational brain state or way of running your brain, which is incredibly stressful. That is, up there with devastating toxin exposure, in my experience, on your nervous system. If you are just running your brain day to day in an extremely critical subconscious programming, which is basically just, functioning from a place of low self-esteem, really never good enough, push, push, push. I'm failing, I'm not achieving enough. If you are running your system like that, it's not an abstract thing. It's not just thoughts, throwaway thoughts. This is electrical chemical signals which are dictating how your functioning neurology is sending messages to all your systems and organs. And so it is a big part of this for most people. And I say this the whole time, but it's really important to not distinguish just personally, or just in terms of like a value system of like, oh no, that's Lyme disease, that's a tick bite, that's serious. But my, chronic low self-esteem, which is just eating away at me the whole time, that's just psychological, that's nothing. Like, it's all part of the sort of what we call the allostatic load. Like, it's all taking a toll on your nervous system. There are so many contradictions, and there's so much involved with this illness, which I can't really mention because I'd be here all day. But certainly people who have a history of post-concussion syndrome, if you've had a concussion, that's a major stress on your system. If you have cranial cervical instability, if you have hypermobility, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, any sort of neck or back injuries, previously, that stuff you all need to take into account. And the really simple sort of visual that I use is all of this stuff, put it in a bucket, not a bucket, but put it as if you are, a foot leaning on a brake in a car. As this stuff piles up, the weight gets heavier and heavier. The foot is just pushing harder and harder down on the brake. And the brake is the mitochondria and the cellular function, and it's just it's slowing down, and at some stage it has to come to a stop. Okay, so on to the next slide. So here's just a graphic to sort of explain what I was saying. And when I talk about dorsal and sympathetic, I'm talking about the fight or flight response and the rest and digest. And there'll be more on sort of polyvagal theory in a different talk, but we really need to come to an understanding of what the autonomic nervous system is and how so many of our symptoms, how can it be so many symptoms like in one body happening at once? And it's because, this is what it is. This is the autonomic nervous system in action. And so if you just take some time and read through that, but I mean, it's sort of self-explanatory, really. All these organs and systems are sending messages back, and the brain is sending messages back, and our body is just functioning from a place of extreme dysregulation that is resulting in our crazy symptoms. A personal story, which sort of broke me out of the mindset of, okay, this is some sort of weird immune illness. I don't know what it is. And I've been told by functional medicine, it's the virus, it's the chronic infection, it's the chronic EBV, it's the mold, the pesticides. And yes, that is true, but there's a place above all those things, and that's your brain and your nervous system. And so my story, where I kind of let those downstream elements go, was a time when I was lying in bed and I had just a normal duvet or comforter on over my feet, and it was feather duvet, very light, and the weight of the duvet on my toes was so heavy, it was honestly like a Stonehenge megalith just pushing down on my toes. I couldn't have anything touching my toes. I had to have them just free from a blanket because it was so painful. And at the same time, I had down one side of my face, it felt like my face was sort of dropping, and extremely numb and strange sensations going on. And I was like, okay, this is neurological. This is not, some kind of immune, have some echinacea. This is a neurological illness. And I feel like it's much more accepted now that it's often described as a neuroimmune condition. But I think the good thing is I immediately just focused on the brain, and my understanding of mind-body work was, if something's neurological and there's nothing structurally destroyed or abnormal, you don't need an operation to fix anything or take anything out. It's just the software which has gone crazy, not the hardware, so to speak. That means I can change this using the principles of neuroplasticity, which is sort of the idea that the brain is plastic. It's sort of moldable. You can reshape it. You can regrow neurons around. It's not that the neurons will ever, that are creating these symptoms ever fully, are destroyed, but you create strong neural pathways. Literally, like I think of forging a path through a forest, you're creating a new path. And so, I don't know why I put this graphic in, but, well, it's not really the full nervous system, but it's a visual for it. And so we'll move on to the limbic brain. And once again, I'm not a neuroscientist, but having just an overview of these parts of the brain, especially when we go back and look at, as I mentioned in the setup, the sort of way you've been running your brain previously before you got ill, learning about these little, elements. The limbic brain is made up of different parts of the brain, and no part does one thing uniquely. It's all interconnected. But you really get to see, okay, well, that's why I'm kind of dizzy, and that's why, my memory is so terrible, and this is why I quite literally couldn't think of a positive memory. It's because it's such a great survival technique. If your body believes you're in so much danger that, it really needs to keep you safe, it's not going to give you access to that great time when you were, 8 years old on holiday and you felt loved and secure, because that's going to, lower your hypervigilance. It wants to keep you ramped up. And so it's going to keep you in a very primal hypervigilant state. And so understanding these brain parts, and even something like with body temperature, and why your hormones going so crazy, you can really start to see. And I, had a massive sense of relief and clarity when I kind of read into these limbic brain parts. In later years, I have had access to a functional neurologist and been able to test for vestibular and sort of cerebellum issues, which really the way to functionally test for that is looking at sort of the eyeballs and using techniques that would be used for sort of brain rehab after concussions and brain injuries, and being able to sort of strengthen those pathways through, practical exercises. And that will help massively with things like the dizziness. But, I'm not an expert on these things, and I don't think anyone's really, right now, I haven't seen anything like concrete about these parts of the brain. And I don't think right now we're at a place to say, oh, these brain parts 100% are the only ones that are affected. But certainly looking into the vestibular and looking into sort of cerebellum, and there is help out there, but it's more widely known as help for someone with a traumatic brain injury rather than a post-infection syndrome. But the takeaway really for the limbic brain, it's this kind of word that is dominating all this function, and it's gathering all this data to figure out, are you safe? Am I safe in this environment with this person in this vehicle? Do I have to lie flat because I'm not safe to sit up? I mean, that would be at a very severe level when you have like bad POTS and things. But it's so interesting. It's really, as I mentioned earlier, it's got its best intention is just to keep you safe. And so if you could simplify the way out of this illness, it is the most mammoth effort in multiple ways, in a visual, in a memory, in every sort of way, can you reverse that feeling of extreme unsafety into a massive feeling of wholeness and safety? And so how do you do that? It's safe food I'm eating, it's safe conversations I'm having, it's safe muscle movement, and it's a really interesting way. And you can't just recover using one method. It will be a holistic, journey back to safety. So the next slide is just another visualization of, the theory, and it's certainly the best theory I've heard and the best interpretation of this illness, which is there is this limbic threat and the trigger has come along, the infection, and it's like the straw that breaks the camel's back, and it's like a light switch. It has just been permanently switched onto extreme hypervigilance, and the downstream effect of that is the autonomic nervous system going into extreme dysregulation. And normally I like to think of things kind of like a wave when it comes to the nervous system. It's like you move in and out of threat. A great example of that physically to witness would be my dog. If the postman comes, like immediately hair up on the back of her neck, along her back, and tail, straight up, barking. And then the postman goes and it's like immediately flops back onto her bed and passes out asleep. And so that's amazing sort of nervous system regulation. The fact you can move into extreme, fear, defense, and then realize there's not a threat and move, so fast into deep rest and digest. And what's happened to us along the way, for whatever reason, we've got stuck somewhere, and we're stuck and we're not able to move out of this extreme threat. And then it gets more complicated because it's like fight or flight and freeze together. So yeah, there's more to it than that, but that's a very loose explanation. And then we go on to this thing called the cell danger response theory, which is about 15 years old. And I think it's, as I said, it's the best explanation of what I've experienced. And for me, it's been, a theory that I've been able to sort of alchemize and make a really decent recovery. So there is a signal being sent, a threat signal. It's being sent to the cell. This is a gross simplification of this theory, but there is a signal sent. The cell gets the message that it's in extreme danger, and the cell membrane literally hardens, and so no nutrients can come in and no sort of detoxing of the cell can happen. And so that's why we get such extreme sort of toxic build up in our lymphatics, and it's not good. And for me, I saw that at a mild level where I would go into a sort of cognitively demanding space and just be completely whacked from just a normal day of cognitive conversation with people. That was when I was at a mild level, to moments when I was learning how to re-walk, where I would be upright on my legs for honestly 10 seconds too long, and it would trigger a crash and the shutdown of the muscles, really, quite honestly. And that could last days and days. And so I've seen it at such extreme ends of this. And so this for me is obviously it's contentious because I'll have the comments off for this video, but I know, well, when you put this information out there, you get a flood of people saying, no, I've been told I have mitochondrial dysfunction. And certainly, who am I to say that you do or you don't? I'm very aware there is genetic diseases which children are born with, and they have mitochondrial dysfunction. But my bet is that if you've had a normal functioning life where you've been able to have a job and go for a run and be filled with energy, and then you get one of these illnesses, my bet is, and certainly in my experience, this is cell danger response. This is a signal. As I've said, this is functional. This is not something where you are inherently broken. However, of course, toxic exposures, they do damage the mitochondria, but I think it's all recoverable. And, you know, people do have mitochondrial dysfunction when they have severe ME. And for me, it was such a learning curve to get my head out of the factors of this is broken, rather than this is just a signal which is being sent that can actually switch off and mitochondrial function will return. And I looked into things for years, and this is just a personal sort of anecdote. And I was like, okay, it takes apparently, I don't know where I got this information, probably some university conference put online. It takes something like 5 days, I heard, for the cell to rebuild all the sort of amino acids it needs to function. And so I really had it in my head that if I had a crash, it would be minimum 5 days until my cells were able to function again. And it was very interesting the first time I had a crash, and I had got, after many months of trial and error, I had got to a place where I was able to truly modulate my nervous system using my sort of extensive toolkit. And I was in a situation, probably a mild crash, but my legs had gone. The muscles in my legs had gone and had triggered. And, you know, instead of thinking, oh my God, it's going to be minimum 5 days, I'm going to have to lie flat, I just kept on going for hours and hours with these tools. And after a couple of hours, I turned off the signal and my muscle usage returned to a pretty weak extent, but it was not at the having to lie flat and not move. And so everything that I thought was sort of proven to be incorrect. But I mean, this is not something that can be done, you know, at a drop of a hat. This takes time, and it takes trial and error. And so it sounds almost too good to be true. I sort of understand. But in the next slide, just a little bit on psychoneuroimmunology. And yeah, it's the idea that we're going to take this sliver of control that we have, this 6 to 8% of our conscious neurology, and direct it in a way which is going to promote what we want, which is, as I mentioned before, the opposite of this hypervigilant shutdown. And we're going to have to throw everything at our bodies to generate a stronger signal. And often it can take, 3 months, 60 days, they say, to create these strong, sturdy new neural pathways. It can happen a lot quicker than that. And I'm really someone that failed deeply at brain training for many years. And I don't think just a straight brain training technique is what it takes most people. I think you need to be taking the stress off your body in so many different ways, emotionally, in a detox capacity, if you're capable of that, in a blood sugar capacity, in a emotional expression capacity, and that's a massive one, which I'll go into. We need to be generating, emotions, positive emotions. Emotions are just neuropeptides, and we need to be flooding our brain with the antidote to this extreme hypervigilant shutdown that our body is experiencing. And it does not happen overnight. In my case, it's taken years and years to very slowly shift my physiology. And I'm not going to go directly into sort of tools. That would be on a different talk. But, this is not just visualize you're at the beach 3 times a day and you'll recover. I mean, that's obviously ludicrous. Like, that's not what this is. It's so much more holistic and personal. And it really is, not just using a tool, set your clock 3 times a day. It's kind of a new constant way of being you have to learn and introduce into your life in a very kind and compassionate way. Alongside, as I say, detox protocols and, as I've mentioned, vestibular eye exercises. So we're hitting this from so many different angles to reduce as I mentioned this word, this allostatic load of stress. I have so much compassion for people listening to this, maybe sort of believing it, knowing neuroplasticity exists, but like it just seems impossible. Like your legs do not work. You've been in a wheelchair for years. Like how on earth are you going to send the messages to the legs that they work now? Maybe you have, your POTS, you try and be upright and then you're immediately back down again. Maybe you're just living at a very mild functional level, but you just can't imagine anything changing because you've tried everything. It really does come down to, here's this visual of, remapping your brain to send different signals to have a different physical outcome. It sort of sounds magic. I am aware of that. But it's doable, and keep watching recovery videos, keep listening to different people's explanation of how they did it, and keep going.